and the calamity that would later wash it all clean. The valleys were generous. The hills kept their ancient counsel. People tended vines and flocks and measured their days by the steady swing of the sun. In the seventh generation from Adam, when the world felt both new and already tired of certain human habits, a rumor ran along the ridgelines. It was not a rumor born among shepherds and threshers, though they carried it in their mouths. It began in a place that did not tire or sleep. It began in the ranks of those who watch. They were called watchers because names have a habit of pretending to be simple when they are not. Watching was not just looking. It was attention braided with duty, a gaze that kept things in their lanes and reminded rivers to be rivers and people to be people. The watchers stood in bright places and counted days against the pattern of the sky. They were glory in the form of sentries. It was their work to look upon the children of earth and bear witness as they grew into their tools, their houses, their songs. They were the proof that heaven was not absent, that it had appointed neighbors on the high places who remembered their names. Among the watchers there was a leader named Semyaza. His name fell like a hawk's shadow across the page, swift and certain. He was a being of adamant vow and restless thought. He looked down and saw fields like green carpets, and rivers like threads of silk, and women whose laughter was as gentle as wind over barley. Beauty is not a crime, it is a mirror. What becomes a crime is how a heart listens to the mirror and what it decides it is owed. Semyaza began to kindle a plan that first felt like a prayer and then insisted on becoming a pact. He spoke to his companions. He spoke of the warmth of mortal life, of the taste of fruit, of the companionship of wives, of the sweet chaos of children running in dust and light. He spoke of the education of a world that had not yet been instructed. He spoke of sharing gifts. Even angels want an oath when they are afraid of themselves. Semyaza stood upon a great mountain that lifted its head above the weather. Tradition calls it Hermon, a place where clouds gather like white flocks and storms go to school. There he asked the others to seal their choice. "We will descend together," he said. "If one hesitates, we all falter, so bind your courage with mine." The number of those who stood with him is given as 200. Think of it as a fullness, a crowd sufficient to change the tilt of a story. They knelt upon the peak and spoke words that tasted like iron and honey. They swore by afterlives and horizons. Then they stepped across the bright line that marks where duty ends and desire begins. It is popular to claim that the first day on earth for those shining visitors was a day of nothing more than sunlight on skin and the discovery of grass. That would be kind, and kindness matters. But the truth is that choices mature quickly when power travels with them. The watchers were not curious tourists. They were makers and tutors. They had minds calibrated to patterns that mortals guessed at but could not name. When they took wives among the daughters of men, they entered into a covenant that did not belong to them. They planted seed and they planted knowledge, and neither plant obeyed the old fences. The first harvest came in the form of children who were too large for the cradles of earth. The giants were not merely taller brothers. They were a statement that the boundary had been crossed and that the world had heard the crossing. The stories say they were vast in appetite, strong enough to crack stone, and careless in their play. What do you feed a child of a watcher and a woman when his hunger learns to stand on its own legs? The answer is everything. The fields were scythed to stubble, the cattle thinned, the stores emptied, the orchards stripped. When the granaries of the meek failed to fill their bowls, the giants turned their attention to the flocks. then to the hunters who brought the flocks home, and then to any house foolish enough to burn its lamp late into the night. There are moments when myth stops being a tapestry and becomes a siren. This was one. The Watchers did not arrive with only the language of desire and the grammar of violence. They arrived with lessons. Knowledge is always a double gift. Light that can illuminate or blind depending on how close you hold it to your face. Azazel, who loved the bright gleam of ore, taught men to draw metal from mountain bones and to hammer it into shapes that answered the hand better than wood or stone. A plow is a kind of promise. A sword is a very different promise. The same forge breathes for both. Azazel also taught ornament, powders that drew attention to the edge of an eyelid, stones that could be set to blink in necklaces like captive stars. To some he gave secrets of mirrors, and to others the logic of spearheads. The world learned at an astonishing pace, and it learned the sweet fever of pride. Other Watchers opened books that had never been copied in clay. One spoke of the cutting of roots and the mixing of leaves, strange medicines that could either mend a fever or persuade a heart to believe it was wise to be cruel. Another broke the sky into sequences and told people how to read omens off the shoulders of constellations, as if Orion had posted notes for harvest on his belt and the Pleiades whispered news of weddings. There were teachings in enchantments, in the binding of words to will. There were charts that measured rain and others that mapped the nerves of animals. A few even taught how to write words that chained other words, the first sentences that could outlast a voice. The earth looked up from its chores and realized it had entered a university without knowing the tuition. At night, the new knowledge glowed. The camps of the giants glowed too, with fires that did not signify warmth so much as appetite. They sang with a racket that startled owls. They practiced wrestling with boulders. They were pleased with themselves in that fresh and unignorable way the very powerful often are. In villages where bread already had a way of growing thin by the end of the month, a shape would sometimes fill the doorway that had no business fitting, and a mother would reach for her child as gently as she could, which is to say, as quickly as she could. Even the bravest hunters had to add up their courage carefully when the ground shook under the steps of something that wore a smile like a challenge. It is hard for a world to complain to the sky. The sky seems busy, yet the old stories are clear that the earth itself found a voice. The ground had tasted blood and found it sour. Rivers brought reports. Winds arrived at the corners of fields with news. The voices of the oppressed carried farther than anyone expected. There is a household truth in heaven that when the low cry out, there are dignities that must set down their harps and listen. The archangels who had kept their posts heard the complaint rising like smoke from a city that is still whole but already on fire in its bones. Michael, whose courage is a beacon, surveyed the damage with a terrible calm. Gabriel, who knows the sound of truth, counted the lies that had begun to sprout around the Watchers like thistles. Raphael, who heals, took note that the medicines being taught smelled of ease, but tasted of poison. Uriel, who keeps the lamps of the heavens, looked down with the trained eye of an astronomer and saw astrology being taught as if the sky were a deck of cards. They stood in the council and presented evidence, not in anger, but in that grave tone, which says that the house is at risk if the rafters are left to rot. In the presence that cannot be written without impoverishing the page, a verdict took shape. The rebellion was not a youthful indiscretion, but a breach that would widen if unsealed. The violence would not settle into a new normal, but would sharpen into a habit. The gifts that had been given without license had already become irons placed upon the wrists of the weak. The decree was simple, and it was carved into the heart of the world. The watchers would be held for a long reckoning. Their children would meet the end that belongs to the violent. The earth would be washed. There was mercy in it, though to name it mercy while the sentence was being spoken would have sounded like mockery in the ears of the afflicted. Mercy for the future is often judgment for the present. Before the sentence fell like a curtain, the story bent toward a man who kept to quiet paths. Enoch had learned to walk as if he were mindful of every pebble's opinion. He was not perfect, but he was aligned. He loved the way evenings smelled when the smoke from cooking fires lay low like a kindly ghost. He looked at stars as if they were not distant, but companionable. He loved God in that unassuming way that gives a man courage without making him a bully. When the watchers felt the bars of the word judgment form around them, they remembered that men sometimes edit the outcomes of heaven by their prayers. They sent couriers to Enoch and begged him to speak for them. It is a peculiar thing to be the friend of the accused and the servant of the judge. Enoch did not pretend that wrong was right. He did not polish excuses until they shone like righteousness. He listened, because listening is also a form of justice. Then he walked away into a place of solitude that was not entirely empty, for there is no solitude in which the listener is absent. He prayed with the clarity of a man who knows his voice carries only as far as truth lets it. He wrote their petition. He slept. In a dream that was more awake than waking, he climbed the stair of light that leads to the world behind the world. He stood before an answer. The answer was not easy. The answer said that a line had been crossed that cannot be politely uncrossed with apologies and flowers. The answer said that the watchers had authored their own chains, and that their sons had authored their own end. The answer said that the world must be tended as a garden, and there are seasons when a gardener who loves green things must cut back to save the roots. Enoch was told to say these things in words that no one could mistake. He woke with tears in his eyes. He delivered the message. Semyaza listened with a face that had learned to fear. Azazel listened, and his hands flexed, as if trying to remember the feel of a hammer. The others listened and thought of wives and children, and of the way fruit tastes when you are not supposed to have it. Some protested with the sharpness of the newly powerless. Some sank down as if the weight of the air had doubled. None could claim surprise. The chains of consequence are forged, link by link, long before they are felt. Enoch's voice did not gloat. He did not permit himself the satisfaction of scolding angels. He spoke as the appointed messenger, and then he withdrew to the edge of the village, where the wind smelled of wheat and rain. You might ask why the story spends so much time with divine beings in love with earth, and so little time with the women whom they claimed. That is because the oldest tellings were written in houses where the scribes were men, and their attention tilted a certain way. Yet the silence of the women is not emptiness. It is presence withheld by the scribe, but not by the truth. Those daughters of men carried a confusion no law had anticipated. They housed children who could fracture a doorframe by toddling through it. They slept beside husbands whose eyes could count stars as if they were coins. They learned that being desired by power is not the same as being cherished by kindness. A generation of mortal mothers watched the edge of the known world break, and kept on cooking suppers, because people must eat, even when myth is behaving badly. There were still moments of goodness. A giant child who loved birds learned to cup his hands so carefully that a finch would perch and sing. A woman who had been taught to mix salves took that dangerous law and used it to ease a fever, without letting it dominate her village. A man who had learned to shape copper into a knife, learned to cut bread and not throats. The world does not fall from its height in one step. It stumbles and grabs for railings. But the railings had been removed and replaced with trinkets that glittered and tools that made a loud, proud sound when struck. The trend was relentless. The poor were pressed. The mighty boasted. Songs began to favor swagger over thanksgiving. The land itself began to carry a sulk. The archangels moved to enforce the verdict. Raphael set out to throw ropes across the larger sins, the kind that try to pass as virtues by wearing clever hats. Michael gathered the courage of heaven into human scale and brought it to bear like a plumb line, showing where walls had leaned too far. Gabriel tuned the air so that lies sounded slightly off-key, even to those who had grown fond of them. Uriel prepared a lantern that could be seen by the one man who would need it when the sky broke open. None of this happened with spectacle first. Rome was not yet built, but the proverb would have applied. Great changes wear soft shoes before they put on boots. The watchers felt the approach of their former brothers as a chill at noon and a darkening at the corners of their eyes. Some fled toward caves with doors shaped like the mouths of beasts. Some gathered their children and tried to teach them humility, as if humility could be memorized on the last day of the semester. Some stood with their jaws set and waited with the kind of patience that expects to be admired. The human beings who had once thought themselves fortunate to be chosen by bright visitors learned that being chosen is sometimes a polite way to say taken. They closed their doors and watched the skies anyway. Curiosity is a cousin of fear. When the taking finally came, it was methodical and unembellished. Semyaza was bound. The words used are serviceable and make no attempt to sing. Bound, as you bind a cart that will otherwise roll away. Bound as you bind a wound that will otherwise pour out the future. Azazel was bound and placed where the dry earth keeps its fiercest secrets. Others found themselves in hollows beneath mountains that seem from the surface to be asleep but contain tales that cannot be told with a straight face. The giants, deprived of their tutors and their favorite props, discovered that brawn is a poor argument when heaven has already decided the case. They battled one another by habit and by hunger. They learned that there are hungers that cannot be fed by victory. The corridors of the world filled with the sound of things being righted. You might imagine cheers, and there were a few. But more often there was a tired quiet. When the tree that has leaned for years is pulled straight, it creaks before it sings. Markets where metal had found a new confidence grew uneasy. Fields where tall feet had crushed seedlings began to recover in shy green. Women who had been told that powders would conquer time found that time had a sense of humor. Old men who had kept their wisdom in low cupboards brought it out and tasted it and found it had not spoiled. Children who had learned to look up in fear learned instead to look up in wonder again. There is a sense, if you stand just right, that this would be a good ending for a first chapter. The rebels caught, the innocent catching their breath, the world pulling itself together like a coat newly mended. But the pattern laid down in heaven included a washing, not only a binding. And the washing had its own terrible beauty. That belongs to later pages. For now, it is enough to say that Enoch, having delivered a verdict and watched the first movements of its carrying out, stood at the lip of the world and listened. He heard the oceans speak in their old voice. He heard the earth mutter to itself like a pot grown thoughtful. He felt the attention of heaven settle on him again. not as a weight, but as a summons. There is a feeling that arrives when a messenger has carried a hard letter and not been despised for it. Enoch felt that grace. He also felt a new restlessness, the kind that sets a man walking before dawn because there is someone to meet beyond the horizon. He would not be left to his gardens and his afternoons. He would be taught the curves of the sky by a patient guide who carries maps made of fire. He would be shown vaults where winds are stored and vaults where seasons sleep. He would count the steps between the world we call real and the one that writes the rules that the real world pretends it learned on its own. And he would be asked to remember. He would be asked to write. He would be asked to stand again between grief and glory and translate for both. Shadows lengthened. The giants quieted. The bound raged in silence that only angels can hear. The people in the valleys did what people always do after history hurls a stone through the window. They swept. They held their children. They made plans with the soft pencil of hope. Enoch looked east. The first light found his face ready to be instructed. Somewhere far off, in a place that poets borrow but cannot own, a path lifted itself into the air like a staircase and waited for his feet. When Enoch returned from the errand that had turned angels pale, the air in his village felt newly arranged. The night after he carried the verdict to the watchers, he did not sleep as a tired man sleeps. He lay down like a scribe who has put away his pen and still hears the whisper of ink. The house was quiet. Ash settled in the hearth like a soft snowfall. Outside, dogs barked at nothing and then decided the nothing was not worth the trouble. Enoch did not count sheep or constellations. He counted the breaths between his heart and the great listening presence that had given him a message and would give him more. It is not easy to be the hinge of a story. The door creaks. The house sways. Yet the hinge remains itself. Morning found him at his threshold with the soft look that people wear after an inner conversation. He went to the place where the hill levels out beneath an old terebinth. There a cluster of men waited, all in their first years of becoming elderly. They liked to sit where news could find them without much effort. They greeted Enoch with the respect one gives a neighbor who has returned from a season that most men will never travel. He spoke little. He did not dress his words in ceremony. He looked over the valley to where a bank of cloud was making a slow parade along the broken line of the horizon. He thought of the way judgment moves without hurry and without the slightest chance of arriving late. It was not long before a visitor came to him with a face like someone who has been told to be brave and is trying. The messenger was tall, but carried his height as if it were a borrowed coat. He had been sent by the Watchers, those very beings who for a time had believed themselves the tutors of humankind and had now learned what it is to be pupils in a hard school. The man was only the last link in a chain of requests. He had the look of a rope that has been pulled. He knelt and used Enoch's name as if it were a safe place to set a burden down. He said that those who had fallen from their posts begged for a hearing. They had heard the sentence from Enoch's mouth and from the movement of heaven itself, yet they hoped, in that stubborn way of hope, that the God who weighs mountains as if they were feathers might weigh mercy more heavily than wrath, if truly asked. Enoch listened with the patience of a field waiting for rain. He did not need to be reminded of the damage that had been done. He had seen orchards stripped, villages made timid, the young taught violent songs. He had watched the faces of mothers who had learned to sit through nightfall with their hands on the shoulders of their children, as if hands could be shields. He had heard the ancient ground speak with a voice that belongs to prophets and ploughmen equally. Still, the habit of his life was faithfulness. Faithfulness listens. Faithfulness writes, even when the ink has the taste of grief. He agreed to carry a petition. The place he chose for prayer and writing was not far from his home, yet it belonged to another kind of map. There was a ledge of rock with a low cave behind it, sweet with the smell of old water. Birds had learned to trust that ledge. Lizards had learned to be quick there. Enoch laid out a waxed tablet and a strip of prepared skin. He touched his stylus to his lips, and then to the page as if to make peace between body and word. He spoke, and in speaking he wrote. The petition did not try to bribe the heavens with flattery. It did not line up excuses like children with palm leaves pretending to be a wall. It confessed. It admitted that seats had been abandoned, that gifts had been misused, that desire had been called love when it was thirst. It asked that the sentence be reconsidered for those who had not yet been bound. It asked that time be granted for repentance. It asked that the sons of the watchers and the daughters of men not be doomed for choices that were sown above their heads. Enoch wrote without ornament, and the nakedness of the words was their only strength. When he had finished, he slept. Some dreams are a broom and tidy the rooms of our minutes. This was not that. This was the dream that remembers the first garden and the last book. He was lifted without haste. He rose as a seed rises, drawn by a light that is not visible to eyes but to which everything true leans. He came to a place where the floor looks like crystal and yet holds the weight of 1,000 worlds without complaint. He stood where elders stand and where fire does not consume but explains. Around him the singing that is always singing did not stop, but it quieted enough to hear a single name when it was spoken, and the name was Enoch. An angel approached whose brightness did not threaten, which is perhaps the most astonishing brightness of all. This messenger had the bearing of one who keeps calendars for the sky. He told Enoch that the Most High had heard the petition. He led Enoch by the hand the way a good teacher leads a boy who has both talent and fear. They passed through halls where books are not many books, but one book with many faces. They came to a place where sentences are decided not by votes, but by the way truth has of standing upright. The answer came as a presence rather than a speech. Yet Enoch received words too, because men are comforted by words and instructed by them. The answer said that the petition had been considered in the full measure of mercy. The answer said that mercy without truth is an opiate that makes men smile while their house burns. The answer said that what had been broken could not be repaired by remonstrance alone, that a rot had reached from rafter to sill, and that the only kindness was to cut away the infected wood. The watchers had been more than negligent. They had been treacherous. They had taught with intent what was forbidden with intent, and their students had used the lesson well. Enoch was to tell them that there would be no quick pardon. He was also given a set of orders that were not for him to carry out, but for him to witness, because part of his vocation was to know that justice is not a rumor. To Raphael was given the binding of Azazel. The angel who heals was to heal the world of the wound named for the teacher of weapons, and the tutor of cosmetics, and the patron of proud metals. Azazel would be taken to a blistered place, a region with a thirst so vast it becomes almost a person. There he would be held until the appointed end, and a covering of rough stones would mark his prison. No one would be able to mistake that cairn for a monument to greatness. It would be a warning that gleams in the sun like a dull knife. To Gabriel was given the setting of sons against sons among the giants, so that the violence that had been taught would turn inward and shorten its own days. He would also stir the violent hearts of the tyrants among men until they wore themselves out against one another. The angel who brings messages would bring this message to the blood, that blood has no future when it despises covenant. To Michael was given the binding of Semyaza and the chiefs of the fallen host. That task would be neither complicated nor theatrical. It would be conducted like the closing of a door that should never have been opened. Semyaza, who had sworn his fellows into courage, would now be bound into stillness. To Uriel was given the warning to a man whose name would one day mean rest for a world about to drown. Uriel would bring light to Noah long before the clouds agreed to their terrible work. The answer carried yet another layer. The waters would be summoned, not as a tantrum, not as a failure of patience, as a judgment that is also a cleansing. The world had to be washed, because the stain had gone into the grain. There would be a vessel built to carry a remnant, and that remnant would be asked to remember, not only to rebuild. Enoch was not told the angles of the hull, or the count of the animals, or the number of days that rain falls when it is tired of falling. He was told enough to know that mercy was planning a future that judgment alone could never reach. He woke with tears on his face and a coolness on his brow like the touch of a teacher who is stern and tender in the same hand. He walked back to the place where the messenger waited. The man stood quickly, hope breaking in his eyes like a thin shell. Enoch spoke the truth without decoration. The petition that had been sent up had been received, weighed, and found wanting. There would be no rescindment of the sentence. The watchers would be bound. Their children would not inherit the earth. The world would be made new through water. Yet those who stood among the innocent and those who turned from the lessons of violence would not be forgotten. Enoch added the tasks as they had been given, the names of the angels and the shape of their errands, the warning to Noah, which already had begun like a lamp lit in a house that is not yet dark. The messenger did not curse. He did not try to flatter this man who spoke with the weight of a mountain in his voice. He bowed and left as one leaves a physician who has spoken plainly about a sickness that can be cured only by the knife. The watchers received the answer, like men who hear the sea for the first time while standing on a cliff. It was lovely and it was terrible. Some raged in private where only invisible walls could be broken. Some threw themselves on the mercy of the silence and discovered that silence does not bend when it has already decided to be a wall. Others stood very still and looked for the first time at the scale of their acts without the help of pride. They felt the approaching footsteps of those they had once called brothers and knew that the corridors of the earth would soon carry a different wind. Enoch did not go to watch the bindings out of curiosity. He went because he had been asked to witness. He went because memory is a sacred trust, and he had been ordained as its keeper for a time. When Raphael seized Azazel, the air around them took on the smell of quenched iron. The ground opened with a reluctant groan, the way a door that knows it must be opened still complains. Azazel fought like an idea fights, with arguments and old victories and the list of students who had welcomed his lessons. None of that mattered in the presence of a command that comes from before beginnings. He was taken to the place that thirsts, and placed there as a lesson to thirsts everywhere. A cairn rose over him, not in honor, but as a barrier and a sign. Enoch wrote what he saw. He wrote that the hill wears a memory forever. Michael moved with simple authority. He approached Semyaza as a judge approaches a defendant who has confessed without understanding what confession is. Semyaza had fire about him yet, a remnant of the authority that once made lesser beings straighten their shoulders. He asked for terms and was given the only term that was left: submit. Chains fell on him that were made of the will of God. Enoch noted that even the wind held its breath for a moment, as if to acknowledge that something heavy had found its resting place. The other captains were taken in similar fashion. None of them was mocked. None of them was comforted. They were set in the dark under the earth where stars do not speak. Gabriel did his work without spectacle. The hearts of the giants turned upon one another as if a mirror had been set before them that showed not their faces but their habits. They made a ruin of their gatherings. Strength became a snare. They learned that a hand that has been taught only to take cannot hold anything worth having. There were battles in valleys where the rocks remember. There were struggles by rivers that carried the story downstream in a whisper that never ends. In towns that had survived by negotiation, people woke to find fear beginning to retreat like a fog that has remembered it has no right to the afternoon. Enoch noted the names of places that would later be lost, because names deserve to be known even when stones forget. While all this unfolded, Uriel walked in a quieter path. He sought a man whose lineage would one day be recited like a thread through a tapestry. He came to a house where a young child slept with the kind of stillness that belongs to those who will carry impossibly heavy responsibilities with grace. Uriel offered dreams to that house and warnings to that father. He offered measurements that would later turn into wood shaped with patience. He brought a timepiece made of obedience. Enoch did not see these visits, for they were not for him to see, but he was told of them, and he recorded them as one records a sunrise seen from the next valley over when all the sky is lit. In the wake of the bindings and the turning of strong hands upon themselves, there was a change in the texture of days. People discovered that quiet is not just the absence of shouts. It is a presence that moves into rooms and sits with families while they eat. The fields began to answer the farmers with something like friendship. The sky returned to being a calendar rather than a courtroom. The tools that had been born in the forges did not vanish, because there is no unknowing what has been learned. But a new restraint settled over the anvils. A plough can still be a promise. A sword can still be a temptation. The difference is the hand that chooses and the story that hand believes it is part of. Enoch, seeing that the world had entered a narrow pass between justice carried out and justice yet to come, turned to his own house. He gathered his family in the long light of late afternoon. He spoke to Methuselah with a gravity that had no sadness in it, only purpose. He told his children what he had seen and what he had been told. He urged them not to let the fear of coming waters drown their discernment. He urged them to stand apart from the pride that always arrives with the first cart of a harvest and insists on being paid in songs. He wrote a letter to those who would live after him, a letter that read like a will and like a prayer. It spoke of righteous paths as if they were real paths with dust on them and the occasional puddle. It listed the names of angels as if those names were not only titles but friendships. He told them that a man can walk with God and still be surprised by where the path leads. Word of his writings spread. People who preferred their stories to flatter them did not care for his plainness. People who had been waiting all their lives for someone to say the most obvious and the most courageous sentence in the room found that sentence in his lines. Children learned his sayings the way children learn the best songs, half by melody and half by desire to belong to something that will outlast them. Enoch kept writing. He put down visions of the heavens that he had not asked to see and could never forget. He described the chambers of the dead and the distinction between those who sleep in hope and those who sleep in memory only. He set the calendar of the sun and the courses of the moon into words that do not rust. He prepared a world for the discipline of water. There remained the sorrow that attends all necessary endings. The watchers in their prisons felt that sorrow as a winter that will never break. The giants in their last circles of violence felt it as the dawning knowledge that strength is not a future. Men who had been charmed by the new glories of artifice and concealment felt it as a waking where mirrors show more than faces. The earth felt it as a relief that hurts. The sky felt it as a patience that must be held a little longer. Enoch felt it as a man feels the cessation of a long pain. Relief brings its own tiredness. The days began to taste of imminence. Clouds tried on shapes that were not ordinary. Animals moved with the alertness that tells hunters to stay home. The wind carried a smell that was not entirely of rain yet, made old men remember floods that had never happened. Enoch rose before dawn and stood in places he loved and said goodbye to them without making a ceremony of it. He did not speak to the terebinth. He did not dramatize his farewell to the curve of the hill where he had written prayers. He simply stood and knew. He knew that his part in the story was changing. He felt the summons to another classroom. There are lessons that cannot be given in fields and vineyards. There are books that can be copied only by hands that are not made of clay. In the middle of an ordinary afternoon, a messenger came to him whose feet did not raise dust. The angel greeted him the way a teacher greets a student who has finished an exam and is ready for the next course. "Come," the angel said without saying it in words. Enoch told his family that he would be a while. He did not explain, because how does a man explain that he is going to walk where maps refuse to follow? He glanced at his grandchildren, and they glanced back with the frank curiosity of those who do not yet suspect how rare their grandfather is. He walked away in a line that did not look like a line. The world tilted, as worlds do when a hinge turns. He was taken for instruction. He was taken to witness what remains to be told in a later chapter. He was taken not as a prize for being good, but as an instrument fitted for a task that required delicacy and courage, and the willingness to describe what cannot be described without breaking it. Behind him, the village breathed. Ahead of him, the heavens opened like a book that is too big for hands, and yet fits the lap of a patient reader. Between those two, Enoch walked as if he had been born for this very walk. Enoch did not step into the heavens as one steps over a threshold that divides outside from inside. He was received the way a page receives ink, by welcoming something that will now live upon it forever. The ascent did not jar him. It turned his senses to a new pitch. Wind climbed around him like a living staircase. Light gathered without glare. Sound became both near and far at once, as if a choir practiced across a courtyard and a whisper spoke beside his ear. He felt the clean certainty that comes when a tool finally meets the task for which it was fashioned. He was a man of earth, but he was also a listener. This new country spoke in forms before it spoke in words. The first figure he met did not need to announce himself. The air did it for him by straightening into attention. Enoch knew the name before it was said. Uriel stood as a flame that had learned restraint. Nothing in him threatened, yet everything in him forbade idleness. It was something in the bearing, like a master of libraries who loves readers but loves truth more. He greeted Enoch without ceremony, and still made the greeting feel like a feast set for a guest of honor. "Come and see," he said, though his mouth did not move. Not come and be impressed, not come and be dazzled, but come and see. It was the difference between a show and a revelation. They traveled without travel. The ground did not move, but the scenery changed itself out of respect. The first hall was a plain, and it was also a court. The floor showed the veins of crystal, as a river shows a net of shining fish beneath the surface. yet it felt like a firm meadow underfoot. There were seats arranged in a curve, carved from a brightness that held no heat, as if starfire had cooled into furniture. There sat elders whose faces were history without age. Enoch did not stare. To stare is to speak without permission. He allowed the sight to impress itself upon him gently. He kept his eyes where a respectful guest keeps them, on the teacher who had brought him. Then the walls unscrolled and the horizon unrolled, and they were upon a ledge that was not a ledge. Before them gaped a chasm as deep as patience. The air that rose from it had the smell of iron hammered thin and then forgotten on the anvil. Enoch heard a sound too regular to be pain and too empty to be music. He looked, and he saw that the chasm held prisons for those who had wrapped themselves in light and then tried to fold it for their own pockets. The watchers lay in that depth like stars pinned beneath glass. Their brightness had turned into something that struggled to remember itself. The bonds did not look like chains. They looked like logic. They looked like a sentence finally completed. Enoch felt no triumph. He felt the gravity of right order reasserting itself in a world that had tried to ignore its own spine. Uriel showed him more than guilt. He showed him the fate of choices. They stood where the earth thins and lets a man look into the chambers of the dead. Sheol yawned like a deep valley inside the ground, and within it lay hollows set apart from one another by walls of idea rather than clay. In one hollow the air was tranquil and tasted like bread just before it cools. There rested the souls of the just. Their rest did not look like the sleep of the weary. It looked like the restful attention of people who have learned to trust that the morning is coming and is not late. In another hollow, the air turned sour as a tale told twice to justify what cannot be justified. There lay the spirits of the violent, and the air around them gnashed even when their mouths did not. A third hollow held those who had missed the mark without malice, who had wandered because they were born to parents who did not know the path. In that chamber, a gentle discipline worked like a slow current, correcting without crushing. Enoch understood that judgment was not a bucket that held only one sort of water. It was a river with many courses, and every soul found its way to the reach that matched its own weight. They turned, and the edge of the world presented itself like a balcony. Enoch saw the ends of the earth the way one sees the end of a sentence that has been fairly earned by the clause that precedes it. There were mountains like upturned spears that had decided to become altars instead. There were valleys where the breath of the planet pooled and cooled, and there were seas that looked less like bodies of water and more like words the earth had whispered for a long time and would not forget. In the north, he saw a range that smoldered without embers, a line of peaks that sighed soft puffs like sleepers. Uriel named them places of fire prepared for a time and a purpose. Some fires are invitations to warmth, others are instruments of correction. Both are fire. The difference is who shepherds them. They came to a garden that was placed not at the beginning of the world but at its border, as if the Maker had set aside a reminder of what the whole might become. It was not the garden of first memory. It was a garden of last intention. In the midst stood a tree whose presence made Enoch feel both tall and humble. Its branches were vast but restful. Its leaves were shaped like praise. Its fruit was not ornament. It was promise. Uriel said without saying that this was the tree of life reserved for those who would pass through judgment and be made durable. Enoch felt the desire that honest men feel in the presence of something holy. It was not greed. It was a yearning to be the kind of person who belongs in such a garden without needing to apologize for the dirt on his shoes. Uriel led him along a coast where rock became honeycombed with windows that were not windows until one learned to look. These were the gates of the winds, the thresholds through which weather enters its vocation. On one side, Enoch felt the cool of the west wind that carries evening and the smell of water. On the other, he felt the keen of the east wind that brings quick mornings and restless ships. Above and below the apertures lay secret storehouses, where storms are restrained and then released according to laws more faithful than any judge or king. Here the winds did not seem like moods, but like trained messengers who bow before setting out and bow again on returning. Enoch began to perceive that nothing was left to chance, except perhaps the small liberties by which courage and love prove themselves. They came at last to the gates of the sun, which were not doors made to swing. They were portals set at the edges of morning and evening, 12 in number along the east and 12 along the west, each a mouth for the path the sun takes month by month. Enoch watched as day entered by one gate with all the dignity of a priest entering a sanctuary, and departed by its western counterpart with the contentment of a worker whose shift has been worthy. He watched the sun in its high house and learned why summer tastes of wheat and why winter speaks in a voice that opens the inside of the mind. He learned that the sun does not hurry except when commanded, and that its obedience sets the tone for the obedience of everything else that lives. Uriel drew his attention to the moon with the fondness of a craftsman showing a delicate instrument to a careful friend. He showed Enoch how the moon measures itself against the sun and gains or surrenders light by a law as steady as breath. He taught that the month is not a mood, but a measured kindness that keeps people from drowning in the undifferentiated flood of time. He taught how the moon sometimes appears where it ought not, and how to know whether one is looking at a truth or at a sign for which one should be gentle but not credulous. He traced the courses of a year counted as 364 days, an elegant square of weeks with holy appointments set like gems at their places. Enoch felt the pleasing click of a calendar that fits within itself without strain. He knew that men would argue about numbers, as men do. But he had been shown the pattern, and he carried it, as one carries a tune, through a noisy marketplace. They paused where a band of stars stood as if waiting for a cue. Each had an angel for a steward. Uriel named them as a father names his children at a family feast, with pride and with knowledge of what each one brings to the table. He taught Enoch that the constellations are not gods and are not gossips. They are servants that hold their posts with cheerful precision. He showed him how the Pleiades carry a gentle promise of spring to those who plow, and how the lion strides through the highest heat like a soldier who enjoys his work and frightens no one who is innocent. He spoke of Orion, not as a hunter with endless appetites, but as a sign that flicks into place to remind men that arrogance has an end. The stars did not foretell the petty details of tomorrow. They held the vaulted roof like carved beams, each in its slot, and sang the structure into trust. There was a harder lesson too. Uriel took Enoch to prisons of the sky. These were not dungeons cut into stone with chains rusting under a drip. They were alcoves of silence where certain stars had been shut because they had strayed from the path set for them. They were a stern sermon in the language of light. Enoch felt a sorrow, like the sorrow that visits a teacher who must close a book on a bright student until the lesson of humility is learned. He felt the justice of it as well. It is a good thing that there is a place for correction even among burning things. They went below the thresholds of normal geography, into caverns that no pick would ever reach. Uriel pointed out the deeps where waters are kept in readiness and the vaults for snow and the barrels that hold hail until a season of rebuke requires them. These were not armories for a deity that wakes in a temper. They were instruments for a ruler who refuses to allow cruelty to entrench itself as custom. Enoch realized that weather is not only comfort and agriculture. It is also a grammar for morality written across the sky where anyone can read it if he will set his neck at the right tilt. A passage later found them in the Valley of Judgment, a place of future tense. It looked unassuming, like a field between hills where shepherd boys might play at throwing stones. The grass knew better. It held a tingle like a secret waiting its hour. Uriel said that here a gathering would one day take place, not a meeting under a tent, but a convocation large enough to make the sun feel it was peering through a lattice. Kings who had learned to kneel only to themselves would kneel here to one they had never before considered. The great fallen would be brought in. The small faithful would be placed where they could finally look up without fear. Enoch felt a hush that was not fear. It was the hush people carry into a room where a patient sleeps and may yet live. Uriel took him to the eastern brightness just before dawn and let him taste time. There is a flavor to time when it is arranged rather than endured. It tastes like citrus on the tongue of the mind. He taught Enoch to count feasts and Sabbaths and to measure night watches so that prayer can find its hour with ease. He wrote these measures into the air and then into Enoch's capacity to remember. Enoch felt how debt and gratitude might be taught to a people by giving them appointments with the holy that cannot be cancelled without the heart feeling foolish. The lessons widened. They entered a hall of works where the crafts of heaven are shown without jealousy. There Enoch saw how letters make worlds when they are set in the right sequence by the right voice. He saw that creation is not a single trumpet blast and then silence. It is an ongoing composition, a theme with variations, a melody that permits counter-melodies but never allows cacophony to pretend it is music. Angels moved like exact thoughts. Some carried tools that looked like principles given shape. Others carried instruments that could be read as laws, not the kind that men vote on, but the kind that makes a sparrow fall within a story rather than outside it. Enoch recognized a kinship with this craft. He had written messages. Now he saw the workshop of message itself. They came again to a place where souls were tended, and here the art of mercy showed itself in delicate work. Enoch had seen the hollows of Sheol. Now he watched a shepherding of spirits in the middle years. Some had learned kindness late and needed to keep learning it until kindness became not a task but a reflex. Some had learned to love justice but had not yet learned to love the people for whom justice is meant. Their faces changed while he watched, a little at a time, like rocks that polish each other in a riverbed not by force but by neighborly contact. Enoch understood that nothing true is wasted. He also understood that nothing false is safe. The cosmos did not merely settle accounts. It made persons. Uriel spoke of the first days and of days to come. He spoke of the secret that is not a secret, that all of this has a center, and that the center is not power but presence. He said a name only angels speak without swallowing. He stood aside, and Enoch saw a throne like a cliff of light. Around it the flames were not consuming but clarifying. Figures came and went like thoughts in the mind of a poet. Among them was one unlike the rest, not because of greater brightness but because of an unsheathable gentleness that yet carried authority. Enoch thought of the phrase "Son of Man." It had always meant a mortal. Here it meant a mortal with a purpose so large that humanity itself would be renovated by its completion. He understood without timeline or place that a day would come when wrong would meet a judge with a human face and would discover that such a face is the last thing wrong can bear to encounter. The vision did not break him, it built him. He watched as books were opened that were not volumes but living memories of deeds. He saw wickedness become the small thing it truly is when standing in the presence of unembarrassed goodness. He saw the quiet exaltation of people who had lived unremarked by historians, and yet would be honored in a court that forgets no small sacrifice. He saw the binding of those whose cruelty had once convinced whole cities that cruelty was inevitable. He did not see the hour of it. He was not given dates to sell to the curious. He was given trust. That was the currency of this place. Uriel took him aside and gave him a task to suit a human hand. Write what is permitted. Write what will help. Do not write what will harm the simple with riddles, or give the cruel a map. Write as a father writes for his grandchildren. Write as a witness writes for the judge who asks only for the truth. Enoch felt the honor of it. He also felt the good strain of responsibility. He asked for a place to sit. Uriel smiled with something like delight, as a teacher delights in a student who asks the right small question. They sat upon a terrace made of the patient stones that never hurry, and Enoch began to copy heaven into earth with a stylus and his memory. He wrote of the calendar that lets a nation keep holy time without letting traders cheat widows with false moons. He wrote of the difference between the learning that raises up and the learning that merely makes pride tall. He wrote of the stores of wind and the gates of day, because farmers would need to know when to plant and when to gather, and because the act of planting and gathering is itself a prayer when it is done with awareness. He wrote of Sheol with care, naming its hollows so that grieving men would not imagine their dead adrift without a shepherd. He wrote of judgment with a surgeon's precision rather than a brawler's gusto. He wrote of the Son of Man with a restraint equal to reverence, leaving room for hope to wake rather than for argument to swagger. They traveled once more, not to a spectacle, but to a quiet laboratory set in radiance. There, angels calculated with what looked like sunbeams and measured with what looked like wind. They counted the increments by which the heart softens when it forgives, as if mercy were a unit one could track the way the sky tracks planets. They examined the strength of vows and the tenacity of grudges, and then let them go, each to find its own consequence. Enoch marveled that the world knew such exact attention. Uriel said that love is exacting, not in pettiness, but in fidelity, and that the Maker does not visit his world the way kings inspect parades. He lives within it with the intimacy of a gardener who knows the stubbornness of his soil and delights in drawing sweetness from it. When they came again to the ledges of the world, Enoch looked down without the old shiver. He saw the villages he knew, small and respectable as commas in a paragraph. He saw the river that had taught him as a boy to count his steps between stones. He saw the mountain where the watchers had sworn their oath and which now looked taller because oaths cast shadows. He saw the valley where a man he did not yet know would begin to build a vessel with the patience of obedience. He saw the faces of his family for a moment, as if the air had polished itself into a mirror to give him fortitude. He saw rain gathering in cupboards of sky, not to spill yet, but to remind the world that cupboards exist for a reason. Uriel inclined his head toward the far places one last time, and the far places responded by drawing near. There were ranges of metal that would one day be quarried and hammered into plows that cut generosity into reluctant dirt. There were seams of coal that waited like sleeping dragons who would awaken in ages when men learned to ask the earth for fuel in return for air that is harder to breathe. There were deeps where beasts slept that men would not meet until they had learned to trap light in a small glass and carry it beneath waves. Enoch was not asked to understand those times. He was asked to sense that the story was larger than his chapter, and to be content with that honorable ignorance. At a quiet signal they turned inward. The halls that had been a court and a school became again a welcome. The elders nodded as if a pupil had acquitted himself competently. The fire along the floor leapt once in salute, and then returned to its study. Uriel placed a hand upon Enoch's shoulder. Not heavy, not insistent, and the touch felt like a blessing granted by one who knows what blessings cost. There was one more chamber to visit. It was a small one. It had shelves, and on the shelves were tablets that hummed a little, as if bees had made a library. These were the records of deeds done in secret that should not be forgotten. The cup of water given, the insult endured without retaliation, the small, faithful yes that changes the course of dinners and dynasties. Enoch reached toward them with the feeling a father has for a child sleeping safely in another room. Uriel nodded. "This," he said, "is why judgment restores. It remembers the quiet things." They returned at last to the place where arrival and departure are the same word. Enoch felt the weight of the earth cool to the soles of his feet. He had seen prisons and gardens, vaults and courts, wheels and wings. He had witnessed stars chained for disobedience, and had tasted the fruit of mathematics set to music. He had stood before a throne veiled in merciful flame, and seen a human destiny seated beside it. The sight did not make him proud. It made him simple. He understood that he was to carry these visions with the steadiness of a clay jar carrying clean water. He would not slosh it about to impress neighbors. He would serve it to the thirsty and let the water speak for itself. Uriel's farewell was not an ending. It was an entrusting. The angel did not bow, because angels do not bow to men. Yet there was a warmth in his look that would have felt like a bow from anyone else. He sent Enoch downward with a word that is the root of many other words: be faithful. The world received Enoch gently, as if it had been instructed to do so. He stepped onto the soil as one steps back into a story among friends. He breathed air that now smelled both of harvest and of pages newly turned. He lifted his stylus. He found his family. He began to write for them, and for their children, and for strangers yet unborn who would need someone to tell them that the heavens are orderly, that justice is patient, and that mercy is the skeleton of hope. Night gathered without menace. Stars pricked the fabric of the dark with the calm, unblinking properness of the well-trained. Enoch looked up and greeted them as colleagues. He remembered their names and their appointments. He remembered which ones could be trusted to stand at their posts through the long winter, and which ones returned in the lambing months to lift the hearts of shepherds. He thought of the hollows of Sheol and prayed with sympathy for the sleeping. He thought of the garden near the borders of the world and made a quiet vow to be the sort of man who would not look out of place there. He thought of the Son of Man and felt his own small fatherhood broaden into a responsibility for honesty that could reach beyond his family to his tribe, and from his tribe to all who would ever read his words. He slept and dreamed workmanlike dreams in which he set letters in rows, and those letters became planks that were fitted together into a vessel of meaning that would not leak. In the morning he walked to the ledge where he had once written a petition. He placed tablets in a satchel like a farmer settles seed bags across his shoulder. He did not rehearse what he would say. He had seen what he needed to see. He had heard what he needed to hear. He would tell it faithfully. He would leave to God what belongs to God, the dates and the flames, and the precise hour when justice steps out from behind the curtain already standing on the stage. He told his house first, because that is the right order. He told Methuselah, and the children and the women who kept the house in repair, and the men who borrowed his tools too often and knew they needed to stop. He spoke of winds and gates and calendars in a way that did not make them feel lost. He avoided the jargon of heaven. He used the measures of fields and cups and market days. He said that the world is kept on purpose, and that there is a difference between studying the sky to make wheat grow and flattering the sky to make a neighbor die. He spoke of Sheol as a place where justice continues its good work out of sight, and where grief may learn to sit on a chair rather than on a thorn. He spoke of judgment as a promise to the poor, and of mercy as a promise to everyone. Word spread of his return, and of the new pages he had begun to copy from memory. People came, not in crowds at first, but in a trickle that turned into a brook that found its way into a river. Some came to argue and left without the energy to continue, because Enoch did not play the game of winning. He played the game of saying only what he had been given to say. Some came to be impressed and left with a smaller but more honest hope. Some came to mock and found their mouths making questions instead. A few came to be taught and left with calendars in their pockets and a steadier pace in their steps. Enoch found that writing became prayer when he did it rightly. He would stop in the middle of a sentence and listen for the weight of the next phrase, as a goldsmith listens for the strike that makes a coin true and not counterfeit. He withdrew sometimes to the ledge and to the low cave that smelled of old water. He spoke the names of the archangels like a litany, and then spoke the names of his children like an answer that had been waiting. He dreamed occasionally of the prisons of the stars, and those dreams kept him modest, for nothing crushes pride like the memory of bright things corrected by a hand that loves them. He did not forget the world around him. He helped repair a fence. He admired the good stubbornness of a goat. He watched a child count the visible stars and gently told the child that there are more and that there will always be more. He brought a loaf to a widow whose store was low and did not let her see the tenderness in his face when she said that the bread tasted of a feast day, though it was not a feast day. He laughed sometimes, the quiet kind, particularly when a neighbor repeated a proverb at just the right moment. He learned that a man who has been to the heavens is not relieved of the obligation to be useful on earth. He did not want to be relieved of it. He preferred usefulness. Each night he looked at the sky and let its order remind him that the coming deluge would also be an act of ordering. He knew the binding of the watchers was an overture. He knew that a wash would follow. He did not count days or try to guess. He tended to the business of telling and living. He would be asked for more. He would be taken again and shown the future in parable and the quiet arithmetic of hope. But that belonged to the next task. For now this was enough. He had learned the map of the heavens. He had copied its key. He had brought back names and measures, and a tone of voice that kept fear on a leash and let wonder run. The first of the visions came in a silence so complete that Enoch heard the small sounds of his own certainty. It was the stillness found in the moment before a school of fish turns, or in the breath a singer takes before a high note. He had returned from the halls of lights and calendars with his head filled in a careful way, not crowded, never jangling, like a shelf where each book knows its place. He expected to be let alone for a while to copy his notes and to visit the old terebinth and reassure it that he belonged to the earth as much as to the high roads. Instead, the world thinned around him as a curtain thins when the lamps are lit behind it. Images gathered. Voices approached without footsteps. He understood that instruction was not over. It had simply changed its instrument. The dream found him beneath the familiar ledge where water once ran and left a sweetness in the stone. He slept with his stylus within reach, because there are seasons when the heart knows that dawn will arrive bearing news. He saw hills roll themselves flat like parchment. He saw cities shrink to the size of toys and then open like seed pods to reveal the motives that had built them. He was not swept away by spectacle. He stood in the respectful posture of a clerk in a royal house, ready to copy. An angel stood to one side as a notary stands by a table. The angel did not speak his name. The presence was enough. What he saw first was a throne that seemed at once very near and impossibly far, as if it sat at the focus of everything. Its brightness did not injure the eye, because the light did what good light always does, and revealed rather than assaulted. The fire around it was the fire that clarifies gold and makes wine honest. There were other thrones near it, and on them sat elders, whose faces were the history of patience. In the midst of that company appeared a figure who was both familiar and wholly new. Enoch had heard the phrase "Son of Man" spoken on dusty afternoons to mean an ordinary mortal. Here was someone with the unmistakable softness of humanity and the unmistakable authority of heaven. He was called the Chosen One by the voices in the vision, and also the Righteous One, and also the Son of Man, as if each title answered a different question, but all pointed to the same person. The Ancient of Days conferred upon this figure honor and judgment, and a kingdom that did not respect the usual rise and fall of empires. Enoch watched and learned that justice would one day wear a human face, and that mercy would not be a mood but a rule. From that court of brightness, the vision carried him into a landscape of animals, and suddenly history dressed itself for a parable. This was the dream that later hearers would call by the name of the animal apocalypse, though it sounded to Enoch like a shepherd's inventory that had grown wise. He saw a bull that was white as untroubled clouds, and this bull fathered other bulls and calves that stood for the first people. He saw black bulls whose temper suggested the stubbornness that grows when a gift is taken for granted. He saw sheep gathered from the side of a mountain and led by a figure who moved like a song remembered from childhood. Wolves prowled and eagles swooped and rams learned to strut, and each creature represented a people and a season and a temptation. The parable was not a puzzle box meant to be solved only by clever minds. It was a map of the long road from the first field to the place where the great house will be opened for all who love justice. Enoch watched raids and rescues, schisms and reconciliations, temples built and profaned and rebuilt, and he saw that every violent king is eventually a bleat in the distance while the shepherd endures. The dream did not spare him grief. He saw the moment when the sheep trusted the wrong shepherds and found themselves led into gullies where shadows collect. He saw the time when the house built for prayer became a market for vanity, and when the leaders treated the flock as an occasion for feasts rather than as a trust. He saw a season when the eagles descended and the wolves declared themselves friends of the lambs, and many lambs believed them because hunger is a persuasive scholar. Yet even in the bleakest pictures, the ground held a stubborn light. A tower was measured with a plumb line that no lyre could bend. There were stones chosen for a new sanctuary that would refuse to fit if the builders tried to cheat. The vision trained his heart to expect a remnant, not as a consolation prize, but as a seed held safe in the pocket of winter. In another vision, the future announced itself in a more arithmetical fashion. Years marched across his sight like beads on a careful string. Enoch saw the march of weeks and the counting of jubilees, a firm rhythm by which history would keep time with heaven. He saw that judgment was not the only great appointment on the calendar. There were seasons when exiles would return and seasons when the faithful would seem to lose their address and would discover that the place of prayer is wherever they stand. He saw that a city could be destroyed and remain a city in the promises of God. And he saw that a temple could be rebuilt and remain empty if its priests had mistaken role for reality. The arithmetic was not the dry arithmetic that produces boasting. It was the sort that produces watchfulness and teaches a people to live ready without living anxious. A question arose in him as he watched. How does judgment fall without the poor being crushed by it along with the proud who deserve it? The vision answered without scolding. He saw the four hollows of Sheol again, not as caves to frighten the easily frightened, but as wards in a hospital where triage is perfect. He saw the resting of the righteous whose patience had been their final prayer. He saw the place where the violent are kept until their violence can no longer harm, and where their memory cannot charm. He saw a chamber for those who had wandered without instruction, a tutoring place where the soul learns the alphabet of goodness. He saw that even in the waiting room of the dead, the judge is a physician. The dream taught him that judgment and healing are not enemies. They are a married pair who raise a household of peace. From the hospitals beneath the earth, the vision raised him again to the court and the throne, and the Son of Man stood once more in the center. Now Enoch saw nations brought before him not with fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of tides. The mighty who had taught cruelty to speak with a friendly voice tried to defend themselves with speeches made of marble and metal. Their words fell like coins in a deep well and made only a small sound. The humble who had kept their promises felt a lifting, not as soldiers lifted on shields, but as seed lifted by spring. Enoch recognized faces in both groups. He understood that praise is a more potent measurement than wealth, and that a cup of water given to the thirsty can weigh more than a trophy in the balance of that day. The dream showed him the end of the watcher's case as well, because unfinished business is not the habit of heaven. Those who had taught forbidden arts with a smile learned that charm is not a defense. They had been bound, and they would be brought up at last for sentencing that would not be reversed by pleas. Their children who had learned violence before milk would not stand in the place of the innocent. Yet the dream spared Enoch any savoring of the downfall of those beings. There was no applause in that court. There was only a sense that the illness had been quarantined and that the house could breathe again. Then the visions opened into hope in a way that left Enoch breathless and grateful. He saw a garden return to the earth, not as a museum exhibit, but as a living neighborhood. The tree of life that he had seen near the borders of the world took root in the middle of a renewed land. Its fragrance drifted like a clear bell across cities that had learned to keep their promises. Fruit hung as easily as answers to honest questions. A river ran with the freedom of a thought spoken at last. Children played with the confidence that no bully would discover their game and spoil it. The old learned to be young without losing their wisdom. The animals made their own treaties that included people as equals rather than as frightened custodians. The sun kept gentle hours because the people had learned to keep holy hours. The moon performed her service without luring anyone into the paltry theater of omens. Enoch knew this was not an escape from history. It was history itself brought to its intended harvest. He saw architecture that remembered justice. City gates stood wide because honest markets liked to breathe. Courts pronounced sentences that included repair for the harmed and the possibility of return for the penitent, and no one called that softness. It was called fidelity to the center. He saw music promoted from entertainment to vocation, as choirs stitched neighborhoods together with songs that named each family, and honored the work of their hands. He saw scribes who did not hoard books but wandered to crossroads and read aloud from the law and from the stories of the elders. And children ask their favorite parts as children request the same tale at bedtime, because the tale teaches them to sleep without fear. Near the end of that scene, he saw a mountain made hospitable. It did not lord itself over the valley like a stern grandfather. It served as a great meeting place. Nations streamed up its sides, and the word streamed did not mean crowds jostling with elbows. It meant that people found themselves moving with the grace of water toward what has always drawn them. They brought gifts of language and art, rather than the old pilgrim gifts of swords and pride. A law went forth that was not tedious. It was a song with a refrain everyone could learn, because it was the same refrain that mothers had been singing in kitchens and that carpenters had been humming while fitting cedar to stone. Enoch felt in his chest an ache that was not sorrow and not exactly joy. It was the ache a man feels when given a glimpse of the end of a long road and told to keep walking anyway. Not all the visions were pastoral. Some returned to instruction with the sharpness of a teacher who likes his pupils too much to let them settle for a half-truth. He saw a simple figure with a lamp enter a house where people had lived among cobwebs, so long they had begun to think of threads as draperies. The lamp revealed everything without cruelty. "This is dirt," said the lamp in its gentle language, "and this is an heirloom. This is a habit that keeps you alive. This is a habit that keeps you from living. Sweep here, dust here. Keep this old chair because your grandfather told stories from it that kept your family honest. Throw out that box of curses." The figure with the lamp moved from room to room. Enoch understood that the coming judgment would be like that. Not a smash, but a visitation that leaves beautiful furniture in its place and tosses the rot. He saw also that the lies of the age had a limited warranty. There were rulers who had learned to decorate their greed with piety. There were prophets for hire who could be persuaded to read the wind in favor of their patrons. There were merchants who renamed cheating and called it the wisdom of the market. Enoch watched their faces when the Son of Man approached, not with a sword drawn, but with questions. "When did you feed me? When did you visit me? When did you welcome me?" Their tongues tangled because their lives had been built for different examinations. The common people who had not memorized catechisms of self-justification passed the test with the ease of those who have done the right thing without doing any arithmetic about it. Enoch felt how terrifyingly simple true religion is, and how evasive the ambitious find such simplicity. A final set of visions bent closer to his own lineage, as if to remind him that prophecy is not a set of postcards from a foreign land, but letters addressed to a family. He saw Methuselah gray and golden with dignity, steady as the pole of a tent. He saw Lamech shaken by the strangeness of a newborn, and then steadied by a message of peace. He saw Noah grow into the sort of man who listens to warnings without becoming addicted to them, who obeys long before spectators appear to cheer obedience. He saw the first timbers hewn for a vessel that would carry a museum of life across an ocean of astonishment. He saw neighbors laugh, and he saw that laughter become nervous, and he saw that nervousness fall quiet in the first long rain. He was not given the elf-counted measures of the vessel or the passenger manifest. He was given enough to love the story without trying to own it. When the visions folded themselves like well-mannered birds and settled into his keeping, Enoch woke with the deep calm of a man who has been visited by a storm that leaves the air clear. He did not hurry to speak. He tended a practical task, because work is sometimes the best seal a man can place upon an experience without losing it to boasting. He mended a fence post and helped a neighbor lift a beam. He ate bread with a simple appetite. Then he called his family and the few who had learned that his house had become a place where news from heaven sometimes knocked at the door. He told the visions as one tells a story to people who are intelligent and beloved and do not need to be bullied into belief. He spoke of the Son of Man without naming places or dates. He described the court and the thrones and the light without trying to outshine the light with adjectives. He gave the animal parables in the friendly cadence of a shepherd telling the village children how to watch the ridges for foxes. He set out the arithmetic of jubilees as if he were marking feast days on a shared calendar. He taught about the hollows of Sheol with unflinching hope. He sketched a future where gardens and cities are friends and not competitors. He named the mountain where nations will learn to sing the same refrain without losing their own melodies. He told them about the lamp in the house and how to make a life ready for that visitation by forgiving and by giving and by refusing to rename cruelty as policy. They asked questions because questions are the honor a community pays to a trustworthy witness. What do we do while we wait? Be faithful, he said, which he knew sounded like a small answer until it is lived. How do we keep from being fooled by wolves that say the right words, know the fragrance of the flock, and know the scent of the shepherd, and do not let anyone trade them for incense from a foreign altar? How will we recognize the Son of Man? By the way the poor stand up straighter in his presence, and by the way the proud stop performing. What happens to the dead who never heard any of this? He spoke again of the wards beneath the earth where justice tutors as well as judges. He was careful to say only what he had seen. That evening, Enoch wrote. The stylus clicked softly. He leaned into the light of a small lamp with the posture of a craftsman sewing a garment he will give away. He set down the visions of the court and the parables of the animals. He numbered the weeks and jubilees without fuss. He drew the lamp in the house with a few spare lines and trusted that readers would know their own rooms by the time the figure had passed through them. He described the garden without making it sugary. He drew the mountain without giving it a latitude, because the point was not coordinates but invitation. He wrote as one writes for people he will never meet, who will recognize themselves in the sentences and feel less alone. In later nights, more visions came. As if the heavens were satisfied with the speed of his pen, he saw strange stars wander and be corrected. He saw kings fall ill with their own flattery and recover when they learned to listen to children. He saw a meekness spread across the earth like dawn light that does not ask permission. He saw that righteousness would one day be the default rather than the rebellion. In every scene there was a mark of the same hand. The judge loved to restore. The king loved to share. The teacher loved to make things plain. The shepherd loved the flock more than the fence. Enoch found that hope had a weight in his chest that was not heavy. It steadied him the way a belt steadies a worker who must lift. When he had finished a copy clean enough to be read aloud without apology, he walked to a place overlooking the fields where barley and wheat had begun to wear their summer colors. He read to the wind first because even a prophet wants to rehearse. The wind approved. He read to the children because they are ruthless editors when adults drone. The children asked if wolves can learn to sing. He said that anything can learn if the right kind of patience is shown to it, and they laughed in a way that told him they had received the parable as intended. He read to the elders, and they asked about dates because elders love to be precise. He smiled and said that precision belongs to the Maker, and that accuracy belongs to us, and that his accuracy was to tell what he had seen and leave the schedules to the one whose schedules never itch. The night after that public recital, Enoch climbed the small slope behind his house and looked up. The constellations minded their duties. The moon cut her monthly path like a faithful voyager. The air felt balanced, as if the world had accepted that judgment is part of love and that hope is the shape justice takes when it lives for a long time in one place. Enoch whispered a prayer that was largely gratitude. He asked to be kept honest in the telling. He asked to be kept useful while he waited. He asked to be kept small enough to fit through the gates of the garden when the time came. He slept without thunder or visitation, as if the heavens approved of ordinary rest after extraordinary work. In the morning he trimmed his lamp and sharpened his stylus and stacked his tablets, and the sound of those preparations was like the sound of a temple being prepared, modest, reverent, practical. He was ready for the next assignment, which would arrive not because he demanded it, but because obedience has a way of attracting new errands. He did not know whether the next vision would unfold like a tapestry or stand like a single pillar. He did not need to know. He had learned the habit of readiness. The year turned with the softness of well-oiled wheels, and yet everything in the air knew that time itself had leaned forward. The bindings of the mighty had been carried out. The great teachers of forbidden craft lay in hollows cut out of the world and sealed by the will that framed the first morning. The giants had broken themselves against one another like waves that forget they are part of the same sea. Villages breathed as if a fever had passed, though strength did not at once return to every limb. Enoch moved among his people as a man who had carried a lantern through a storm and who now trimmed the wick and set it on a common shelf. His words were a household cure. They did not glitter like talismans. They tasted of grain and river water and discipline, and they lodged in the bones where they could be useful when the weather turned. He began then to gather his family for lessons that sounded like farewell, without announcing themselves as such. Methuselah sat within reach, a steady pole for the tent of that house, and Lamech listened with the anxious dignity of a man who has sensed the mood of the world changing and wants to stand in the right place when the change arrives. Children came and went like birds, hopping near and then flying a short distance away to try their own wings. Enoch never scolded them back. He let them circle as long as their circles returned them to the center. He spoke of customs that would keep them upright when crowds began to run. He spoke of mornings when prayer should be a habit, and of evenings when gratitude should be the last word a mouth speaks before sleep. He wrote as well, working into tablets the things that cannot be held only by memory if they are to outlast grief. His epistle took shape in lines that never labored for grandeur and never stumbled into vagueness. He said that the world loves to teach men to bow to the loudest voice in the square, and he said that the heavens teach men to bow only to the voice that never needs to shout. He told them that the eyes of the Most High seek the small faithfulness that is the seed from which large mercies grow. He named the sins that had filled the valleys, not to humiliate, but to vaccinate, for there is a medicine in truth when it is administered by a hand that honors the patient. He urged the just to keep their justice smooth-edged and fit for daily use, not sharpened into instruments of pride. He reminded them that when the world is angry, it will offer bargains, and a bargain that asks a man to forget his neighbor is an invoice from a debtor whose credit has failed. It was in those days that a child was born whose looking changed the light in a room. Lamech came to Enoch with a private dread folded inside his joy. The boy had a pallor like moonlit snow, and eyes that opened upon the world, as if the world were a page being read for the first time by an author. Lamech feared that the strange beauty meant the child belonged more to the bright ones than to the clay folk to whom he had been given. The father's voice carried the tremble of a man who will protect his house with a good staff and is suddenly confronted by mysteries that no staff can negotiate. Enoch listened with the care he always offered to fear when fear arrived honestly. He looked upon the child, whose name would be Noah, and what he saw was not trespass, but vocation. He told Lamech that the boy was not the seed of a trespass, but the answer to a plea. He told him that the brightness in the boy's face was not theft from heaven, but a reflection granted for a task that would require the patience of prophets and the strength of shepherds. "Do not fear," he said in the low tone a man uses when speaking to a spooked animal, "because truth is kinder when it is spoken softly." Noah grew the way the best trees grow, down and up at once. His roots sank into the reverence his house kept. His crown lifted toward instruction with calm hunger. He was quiet without being timid. He was rigorous without being severe. He learned the patterns of the sky without falling into the common mistake of imagining those patterns could be bribed. He learned to love wood in the way craftsmen do, not as a lump to be mastered, but as a living partner that cooperates with hands that listen. He was not the kind of boy who makes a story by breaking things. He was the kind who makes a story by keeping promises made before his birth. While Noah lengthened into his calling, Enoch felt visitations at the edge of waking in which a familiar light arranged itself into a guide. Uriel moved through these moments as a teacher moves through a classroom where the students are almost ready for the final exam. He did not speak long speeches. He pointed. He placed in Enoch's mind the name of the man who must be warned, which was the name Enoch already loved. He placed in the mind of Noah the knowledge that wood has measurements honest men can trust. He laid out purposes like tools upon a bench. He showed the line of the flood without forcing a single wave to arrive 1 hour before its appointed time. The rumor of water began then, not in the mouths of people, but in the conduct of the creatures, and in the way the air tasted when it blew off far seas. At first, only the hunters noticed it. Game moved along old paths, as if some ancestral alarm had rung. Birds flogged the sky in skeins that looked like runes. Later, even the inattentive sensed it, though they could not have named their sense. The wind carried into the folds of tents a scent that was neither the gentleness of spring nor the fatness of midsummer. It was the astringent clean of a house being prepared for guests and for a physician at the same time. When rain did fall in those months, it fell with a curious purpose, tapping on leaves like an inspector's finger, and running off with an eagerness that made children shout without knowing why. During that season, Enoch's counsel became the steady music under which other musicians played. He warned his house against the old tricks that return whenever a people grow anxious. There would be sellers of charms and brokers of dreams, and arrogant men passing themselves as saviors through the villages with rhetoric heavy as cheap incense. He taught his family to examine words as a money changer examines coins, ringing them upon a hard surface and listening for the note that means pure metal. He forbade despair as a kind of blasphemy, because despair claims that the Maker has abdicated. He forbade glee at the coming judgment, because glee at another's ruin is the signature of those who have never understood judgment as a gift. Noah began his work in a manner that made mockery look like the hobby of the lazy. He sought a grove that knew how to grow straight. He learned where knots are a blessing and where they are a hidden fracture waiting to betray a beam. He examined grain until patterns from creation slipped into his hands and taught his hands to be obedient. He measured and counted and made marks upon the ground with cords that held true no matter how the eye tried to cheat them. He refused to hurry. Haste is a lack of confidence in providence, and Noah had no such lack. His neighbors peered from behind a hedge of laughter. They said that the boat was an insult to the good sense of the valley, that the sky would never consent to carry such an absurdity upon its face, that the future cannot be stored in a hull. Noah hammered and did not answer. There is a sentence the wise learn early. Work is an argument that convinces even the contemptuous if it is continued long enough. Enoch moved between the worksite and the ledge and the table where he kept his pages. He recorded what should be remembered. He visited the old places of prayer and learned to bless them for what they had taught him, and to bless them again in advance for what they would teach others when his own feet no longer pressed their dust. He loved the world with the love of a man who is leaving it without bitterness. The shape of the flood had entered him. He did not fight it. He did not indulge it either. He understood washing. He understood pruning. He understood how a harvest clears the field, so that the field can be a field again. In visions that were not exactly dreams, Enoch saw how the judgment upon the giants would echo beyond their deaths. The breath that had animated those great bodies would not depart to a harmless distance. The spirits of the violent would linger like the smell of smoke in a garment after a house fire. They would not be granted bodies again. For bodies are trust, and the trust had been broken. They would become parasites of the living, whisperers of malice, discontent that searches for a mouth. This was shown to him so he could instruct his house not to imagine that the flood would carry no aftermath. Evil that has been embodied and then slain does not vanish. It seeks to survive as a suggestion. Enoch wrote this warning without drama, and with very plain instructions that a man can use when a mood unfriendly to his neighbor begins to feel like his own idea. There were glances too toward the far end of water, images as brief and exact as the gleam on a knife edge. Enoch saw a dove that would carry news on its wings and return to a pair of hands that had learned to weigh hope. He saw a bow of color set across the air like a promise taught to sing. He saw beasts stepping down a ramp into a world that had been made simple again by sorrow and given back to patience. He did not make a ceremony of these glimpses. Glimpses are gifts that can sour if handled with vanity. He tucked them away and said nothing except to remind his people that no judgment worth the name ends in itself. All true judgments end with some form of covenant. As the great work rose, and the ribs of the vessel began to suggest a body fit for a sea, the last ministry of Enoch on earth drew near. He was not surprised. He had never mistaken his task for a throne. He had never collected disciples the way insecure men collect compliments. He had been a steward, and stewards know when to hand over the keys. The summons came without trumpet. He felt it in the way an orchard feels it when the gardener's hand approaches with a knife that is sharp but kind. He kissed the heads of the children. He laid a hand upon Methuselah's shoulder and upon Lamech's. He looked upon Noah with a long tenderness that did not burden the man with expectations, but honored him with recognition. He told them to continue the ordinary pieties and to keep their tools oiled and their words clean. He told them that grief will make strange requests, and that people under grief sometimes ask to be contradicted with love. He walked out of the village without ceremony. It is a sign of affection when a village lets a man leave without turning his departure into a spectacle. He climbed the familiar slope. The terebinth stood like a faithful usher. The ledge received his steps with the memory of many prayers. The air was the same air he had always breathed. Only its attention had changed. He was not alone, though there was no crowd. A presence drew near as water rises in a well that has been coaxed by rope and bucket. The taking was not a vanishing in smoke, it was a completion. He felt that he had been stitched into a larger cloth, and that the cloth had been waiting for his thread. Tradition holds a fine fondness for numbers, and so it notes that Enoch's years were as many as the days of the sun's course. There is a poetic honesty to that tally. He had learned to love the calendar not as a machine but as a devotion, and now he was allowed to match the number of his days to the measure he had taught. The earth did not resist him. It released him. He did not push against gravity. He was invited by something gentler. Those who saw it were quiet. There are events that teach communities not to shout. It is possible that a wind rose and that dust performed a small dance, and that birds kept silence, because sometimes birds are wiser than men about thresholds. It is possible that a brightness gathered that did not glare, and that a figure attended whose hands had led Enoch across the terraces of the heavens. It is certain that when his family searched for him later, they did not find him, and that they spoke his name softly for a while whenever they looked at the sky. News of the taking reached the places where the bound lay. It is no great thing to hear in the dark, but some sounds will travel where the feet cannot. The memory of the righteous is a trouble to the rebellious, even when his voice is no longer heard at the city gate. The taking reached also the workyard where Noah measured beams, and it steadied his hands. The loss did not unman him. The sign heartened him. Teachers who depart at the right time do not leave orphans. They leave heirs. Noah learned to work with the calm of a man who has seen that the story he serves is served also by those who stand above the storm line. The last season before the flood felt like a house that has been readied for a move and is waiting for the wagons. The vessel stood complete, its belly a promise, its keel a sentence written by a patient will. Animals began to appear with a readiness that mocked the wise who had mocked the project. Curiosity brought them at first. Obedience kept them. The boy who had once counted stars now counted pairs. The men who had once counted prophets now counted arguments, and found they had none that could do more than echo in their own chambers. The sky practiced the music it would soon perform, gathering and releasing, breathing like a large creature with a good heart. The ground drank small rains, as a man sips a cordial before a long night. When the waters came, they did not arrive as a single blow. They arrived as a conversation the world had been putting off and could no longer avoid. The fountains beneath the deep places loosened their tongues and spoke upward. The doors that are set at the edges of the clouds opened in a measured courtesy and then widened into certainty. It rained in sentences, and then in chapters, and then in a long book that read the mountains to sleep. Those who had prepared were in a place that had been prepared. Those who had promised themselves that tomorrow would be the same as today discovered that tomorrow is a king to whom excuses bow no longer than a moment. Enoch did not see that rain from a doorway. He did not watch the first heavy drops slap the dust into small dark coins. He had been gathered to the place where witnesses are taught to rest. Yet his writing bobbed atop the memory of his people the way the vessel bobbed upon the waters. His pages were not fragile in that flood because they had been made of what survives. They told the story of why the world must be washed and of why washing is not ruin but renewal. They taught those who floated how to dream correctly in a cramped space and how to be grateful for the smell of animals when the alternative is the smell of a world forgetting how to be a world. They taught them to wait without turning waiting into a god. The rains ceased, as all judgments must, that are sent to teach rather than to indulge the anger of the strong. Waters settled their accounts with valleys and hills, and once again became the servants of life. A dove went out and came back with a small truth in its mouth. A ramp descended, and the congregation of creatures stepped into a chapel made of air and distance, and silence and second chances. Wood creaked as it dried. Pilgrims stretched the legs of their patience. The first altar on the new ground smelled of gratitude in the way all true altars smell, which is to say, like something pleasant placed into fire with trust that fire can be a friend. Noah lifted his face. He had the look of a craftsman whose longest project has been both vindicated and surpassed. He knew that the craft had been the means and not the end. He knew that obedience is the only art that never goes out of fashion in the councils of heaven. Above him, a bow of colors appeared like a banner hung from a city wall to inform the citizens that the siege has ended. It was a sign placed not only for men, but for God to look upon and remember, which is a mystery as deep as the first dawn. To say that the judge remembers is to say that mercy is a habit that heaven keeps on purpose. Somewhere beyond sight, Enoch watched the bow the way a father watches his child step from across a crowded square. He was no longer the writer holding a stylus over wax. He was a witness who had been translated into a room where language does not fail. If later tellers gave him new names and fresh roles in the choir of the bright ones, that is their affection speaking. What matters is that he was welcomed. What matters is that his leaving taught those who remained to look up without superstition and to work without the complaint that makes work bitter. What matters is that his memory became a right-sized star, set not in the sky of vanity, but in the sky of instruction. The flood subsided. The earth steamed like bread just pulled from an oven. Seeds that had slept beneath the last world's clutter awoke and began their patient arithmetic. People relearned old songs and discovered that they still worked when sung slowly. Judges relearned that their hands must be empty of bribes if they are to feel the delicate weight of fairness. Children asked new kinds of questions. They have always been the best tutors in ethics. The world did not become a garden overnight. It became a field worthy of planting. That is a beginning honored by the Maker, who prefers beginnings over finales when dealing with people. Enoch's pages continued to pass from hand to hand. Scribes copied and miscopied. Priests remembered and forgot. Lovers of secrets carved elaborations, and some of those carvings were beautiful, and some were less so. Yet beneath the embroidery the cloth held. The story of the watchers and the giants and the binding and the ascent and the flood remained as clear as the line a river draws through a valley no map can afford to omit. It told later ages that knowledge is a sacrament when given with permission, and a poison when smuggled into the soul for the thrill of it. It told them that power and appetite are twin horses that must be bridled together or they will wreck the cart. It told them that the heavens are orderly and that their order is not a tyrant's grid, but a song in which all parts are welcomed, so long as they keep the tune. In that renewed world, men built fires against the evening and told stories to children whose eyes mirrored stars. Among the stories was one about a man who wrote what he saw and walked with God until walking with God meant walking where feet do not find dust. The children always asked whether the man will walk back. The elders smiled and answered in the way that keeps hope from spraining its ankle. They said the man had already walked back because his words had remained, and those words knew the way to the heart, as well as any traveler knows the road to his own door.